Hi, I'm Gigi Engle. I am a certified sex educator and author of All the Fucking Mistakes, a guide to sex life and love.
So let's dive in first and get your sexpert origin story. Like, were you always interested in sex and how did you make it your job?
Yeah, sure. I started out as a sex writer. I worked for a small millennial website, Elite Daily, which is now like massive, but at the time it was very
Uh-huh.
small. And I was always very interested in all the sex content. And so I kind of became like the go-to person for that. And I had like no filter and I was very interested in it. And then the more I was writing about it, the more I realized there just wasn't a lot of like really good in-depth journalism around sex. It was all kind of like, can I make my pussy taste different? Or like 50
Uh-huh.
positions to please your man and like that kind of stuff like that. And so I wanted to have more in-depth research journalism. So I started doing a lot of that. And there's a lot of great journalists who do that now, but I think I was one of the first ones, which is exciting. And then I wrote an article when I went freelance for Teen Vogue that was about anal sex, and
Uh-huh.
people like lost their shit over it.
Oh, really?
Like
That was how you like really found your footing?
yeah, it was crazy. Like it was the most I've ever been trolled to this date. Um, yeah, like people lost their minds. It was actually really funny. And I got called like a sodomite on Fox News. It was like a whole thing. It was wild. So um yeah, it was crazy. So I then was like, oh, I'm not certified in sex education, and I feel like if this is the kind of attention that my work is going to get, then I should be. So
Uh-huh.
I went and I got certified in sex education, which has been very useful. And now I am just finishing up my grad degree in psychosexual therapy, so I'll be a full sex therapist in the next few months.
Oh,
And
congratulations. That's awesome.
yeah, it's exciting. And I wrote my book, All the Fucking Mistakes, in 2020.
That's interesting that you say that about the certification. I've been thinking that a little bit for myself too, just like the conversations that I have on this show. And you would recommend it? You feel like it really just gave you a better foundation?
Yeah, I think it gave me a really good foundation. There's things that you don't even realize you don't know till you know them,
Uh-huh.
because our sex education we have in North America, pretty much everywhere.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say just America, it's literally everybody, is terrible. So there was like so much stuff I didn't know, but I didn't know it.
Right, right. Okay, so I've gotten a couple requests to do episodes about specific kinks, and I thought you would
Mm-hmm.
be the perfect person to talk to. You write these really great explainer articles. So, I guess first of all, let's start with the difference between kink and fetish, which I feel like is commonly they're like conflated.
Yeah, it's actually one of the most common questions I get. So there's kind of like the umbrella term of kinky, which is like all sort of non-normative sex stuff or non-normative things, acts that give you sexual satisfaction, essentially. Sort of like the big kinky umbrella. And so that's kind of like kink. And then a kink is like a sexual interest in something that is non-normative. So something that's like act specific or object specific. Like you could have a kink for spanking, a kink for a breeding kink, a kink for like leather, that kind of thing. And a kink is something that you're interested in and something that you would like to have be a part of your sexual experience. Whereas a fetish is an interest in a non-normative sexual act or object, but it's required in order for you to reach peak arousal or to fully enjoy that sexual experience. So basically, a fetish is like a really intense need for something, whereas a kink is more of a preference.
And with the fetish, you're not getting off in other ways.
I mean, for some people, if they have a really intense fetish for something, it may be like off the table that they can't get aroused at all unless their fetish object or act as a part of the sex. Other people like may consider that their peak arousal is when they have the fetish object or
Uh,
act, but they can still enjoy a sexual experience. It really depends on how fixated you are, but
Interesting.
it's very much like a gradient.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Okay, so let's start with praise kink, which I feel like
Mm-hmm.
has been kind of a new buzzier kink that I've heard.
Yeah, praise kinks are a bit of a media darling at the moment. And I think that there's been a lot of chatter over the internet, and kind of it's gained popularity because there's been sort of confusion between what a praise kink is and what it is to just be treated well.
Uh-huh.
And that's it, like just I know it's just incredibly depressing because like we live in this like heteronormative patriarchal society where men are like, oh, I would love the opportunity to do the bare minimum for you. And you're like, that's great. Thank you very
I love
much.
that take. Yes.
So I think that's why it's gained so much popularity. People be like, oh, I have a praise kink. And it's like, no, actually, you just like want to be treated nicely. And like, that's so sad. Like, that's terrible that we live in a world where like you have to turn something into a kink because it's so rare and it feels so good when someone does it. Like, that's fucked up. So just saying.
No, you're
More like,
totally
that's more
right.
like an aside comment.
Slight digression on that exact point. So I got a happy ending massage and I felt so much like I was the center of that act because I paid to
Mhm.
be the center of that act. And it
Mhm.
was transformative, but I was like, what the fuck is going on that is so rare to me? Like,
Yeah. I mean, first of all, good for you. That's awesome. Second of all, that's just like, yeah, it kind of like that paints the picture, right? That like we're
yeah,
so used to being like touch starved or being treated like shit that like you're like, oh, now I have a kink. It's like, okay, we need to know the difference between this. So that's like one of the things I address when people are like, oh, what's a praise kink? And a praise kink, it's like, you know, people are like, what's the difference between a praise kink and getting, you know, like a compliment?
uh-huh.
I think we can kind of all universally agree, at least for the most part, that getting a compliment feels good. Like everybody's enjoying
Yeah,
getting a compliment or being told that they're good and nice and pretty. It's like, yeah, we all like to be told those nice things. But a kink, it becomes a kink when it gives you sexual arousal or satisfaction to have
right.
that kind of language be a part of it. And I think that's kind of like where the core difference is. It's like it's a kink when it becomes sexual. And like there are lots of different terms that are kind of involved with that, like being called like a good girl or being told you're doing so well, and it's like a part of sex and it's something that gets those sexual fires going. And so I think that's really the core difference.
Anything we need to know about caveats about this praise kink or anything unique?
I mean, I think it's something that can be explored if you're not sure if it's something that's a kink, because I think sex education, as I've said, is absolutely terrible. So we may not know that it's something that's giving us a sexual charge. So I think that takes a little bit of really considering what it is that you get out of being told like nice things. Or you, if you like being called a good girl, or you like being told how good you're doing, like, is it sexual or is it because you like being told nice things? And
Right.
only you can make that call.
I mean, this seems like you would be able to try it with a lot of partners. Like you wouldn't necessarily have to go to FetLife. I mean, you could, of course, but
Mhm.
it's a
I
pretty
mean, I think it's
straightforward
a
kink.
pretty,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a pretty accessible one. Like you don't need
Yes.
to buy a bunch of gear. You don't need like whips and chains and rope, although I would argue you don't really need that for any kink. Um, but like it's an accessible one. And it's one that is, I think, it's a little bit different than let's say like its opposite, which is a degradation kink, like being told, you know, you're a filthy little pig and stuff during
Yeah.
sex. Like that's a little more like someone might be a little bit more antsy about that kind of language because it's degrading. Whereas like a
Uh-huh.
praise kink is like you're saying nice things to somebody. It's kind of an easy one.
Yeah. Probably not a lot of harm's gonna come from that.
Yeah. I mean, it's getting sexually aroused by someone saying like really affirming nice things to you.
Period. End of sentence. Okay. I think we
Mm-hmm.
covered it. So let's talk breeding kinks,
Mm-hmm.
which is an interesting one. And I totally get it. Like, I don't want to have a child, but I get the arousal from the idea of it.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I've like participated in that kind of early relationship sometimes with partners where it's like we're like fantasizing about the
Mm-hmm.
idea of like, what if we did, even though we don't want to.
Yeah. I mean, it's about playing with edges. Like it's, you know, taking risks that feel dangerous, which kind of can get the sexual fires really going. And I think that's sort of the main appeal. And there's also this aspect of it in more sort of fantasy play where things like being a human cow or doing
Uh-huh.
alien implantation, it's like your body is being used and you're being dehumanized, which can be another layer of it.
Uh-huh.
But sort of like your classic breeding kink where like you are just like playing around with the idea of getting pregnant. It's mostly about that danger thing. And I think it's taken on a new taboo since the overturning of Roe, like a new level of almost like sick eroticism that I
Yeah.
think is like it's got, because it's like there's a lot of shit at stake.
Yeah. Explain that. Has there been a change in people's interest?
I think that
from what you've
it's
seen?
because of the row stuff, it's become, people have been writing about breeding kinks more often because they're like, oh, what does this mean for that kink? And I think a big common misconception is that everybody who engages in this kink is engaging in risky behavior. But really it's about, and like some people are, like some people really who are like, they might really legit fuck around with like being really risky. And like that's your business as long as you know what you're doing and everybody's consenting. But most people who are engaging with the breeding kink are not actually interested in genuinely putting themselves in harm's way or in a risky situation. It's more about the fantasy of it. So like you may be on like the pill or a patch or some other form of non-visual birth control, or maybe you're tracking your cycle, which I honestly do not recommend. I never recommend the pull-out method or tracking your cycle as a method of birth control. It's just ovulation is famously unpredictable.
Yeah.
But like a lot of the time, and people have a lot of discussions and they're being really careful around the actual getting pregnant. It's more about the like fantasy of it, just like all fantasies that we engage with in role play. It's like when you're doing a ravishment fantasy or a rape fantasy, you don't actually want to get raped. It's part of a consensual non-consent fantasy that is like negotiated and discussed and everybody's on board and you actually do feel safe to play with those edges. It's not, you're not really putting yourself in danger.
Yeah, I think that is maybe the most common misconception about this kink is that people are actually trying to get pregnant. The vast majority are not, right?
Yeah. Of course, I do find that when I'm like with couples, having baby making sex can actually be like it gets very boring and tedious because like it starts to very much become about having babies. So actually like I have suggested that couples see if they would be interested in trying like bringing in like breeding kink while they're trying to get pregnant, because it's like adds a layer of sexiness to it.
Yeah. And
because then it becomes like the breeding thing becomes hot as opposed to being like obligatory missionary 2 pumps and we're done kind of situation.
That's the perfect time to take advantage of the fantasy of having a baby when you're actually having a fucking baby. So I guess some people do explore this though in kind of a risky way. So I guess, are there any caveats or guardrails you would recommend to people that were into this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you are going to engage with a breeding kink and you're going to kind of just like throw caution to the wind, that's completely your business. As long as you and your partner are both consenting to it and your partner and you are aware that you're not on birth control, that this actually is like a risk that you're taking. We get into really shady ethical territory if someone is playing with a breeding kink and they're not informing their partner of the risk that they are taking too. Everybody who's having sex deserves to have that be something that they're both consenting to. And if both of you agree that like you don't give a shit or whatever, or you're like gonna just go for it and you're gonna take that risk, that's your business. You do you. But both people need to be informed. And I think it's also really important that if you're going to do that and you're going to be doing fluid bonding, which is sex without barrier methods, to be sure that both of you have been tested for STIs so that you are aware of like where your partner stands and where you stand, so you can both make that decision. Because there's no such thing as risk-free sex, but it is important that both partners are able to decide if it's a risk they would like to take.
Yeah, well said. Is there anything else you would like to tell the privates before we wrap?
Yeah, basically, I think the only thing I would say about both kinks is that like there's no such thing as a weird kink or a kink that's abnormal or that a kink that makes you bad or dirty, and there's nothing wrong with having any kind of kink under the sun. The most important thing is that everybody who's involved is a consenting adult. And other than that, we live in this world that shames everything about sex, but life is way too fucking short to not let somebody piss on you if that's what you want.
Amen. Okay. Thank you so much.